Hey, Merry Christmas, everyone. I hope that this season has been meaningful for you as you've been journeying through Advent. I know it has been for me and for my team. And there is something around this Christmas season that I have been centering myself on that has been really helpful, that I believe is going to be helpful to you as well. And it really begins around this idea that Paul wrote about in Galatians 4:4 when he said, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son." It's around this idea of timing and the timing of Christmas and what God was doing and how that helps us this Christmas season. And out of this idea of timing, the passage that I've been anchoring myself on this Christmas season comes from Daniel chapter 2. And the context is this. In 605 BC, the Babylonians came into Judah, the southern part of Israel, and deported the Jews, or at least the first deportation included Daniel. And he ended up in the court of the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, in Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he doesn't understand what the dream was about. And so he consults with his magicians and astrologers, and he says, "I want you to tell me what my dream was and interpret it." And they're like, "We can't do it, but Daniel can." And Daniel says, "God has given this to me." And he says, "Nebuchadnezzar, you had a dream about a statue that had 4 metals, gold, silver, bronze, and then iron, also mixed with a bit of clay. And Daniel said that each of these metals represent 4 empires that are to come, beginning with you, King Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon." And then Daniel begins to lay out this interpretation. Now, he doesn't say that the 4 empires are Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. It's Babylon because it's with King Nebuchadnezzar. But as history unfolds, the clarity of this prophecy comes into view, that these are the 4 empires Daniel was prophesying about. And then after Daniel gets done talking about this 4th empire, it's verse 44 that is just remarkable, where Daniel writes, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever." And so Daniel says, like, when Rome is on the world stage, that's when God is going to enact His everlasting kingdom. And when Jesus is birthed onto the scene, we are in the midst of the Roman Empire with Caesar at the head. And it's astounding what God was doing through the Roman Empire to prepare the world for the coming of Jesus. But it wasn't just what God was doing through the Roman Empire. It's what God had been doing throughout these kingdoms as they ruled the world leading up to the time of Jesus. And so I just want to highlight a couple of things from what God was doing in the midst of these empires when they were ruling the world stage. When the Babylonians were ruling the world, this is when they came in and they started to exile the people of God because they hadn't been living into obedience to God. And they found out in the midst of exile that God is serious, that God had joined Himself to this people, had given them His commandments, His words, His teachings to say, this is how you live to represent me well in the world. And they hadn't done that, and they realized God is serious about how He is represented in the world, and they are exiled. Then you have about 70 years after that first deportation that you have the Persians rise to the world stage under Cyrus the Great. And in 539, he goes into Babylon, and now the Persians are ruling the world. And a year later, you have the Edict of Cyrus, where Cyrus says, anybody who is in my confines of my kingdom who have been displaced can go back to their native land and rebuild their sacred structures. And so now the Israelites return to the land, but they realize we're still under the boot of an empire. And so now there is this longing, this ache for a Savior to come because it had been prophesied in the Scriptures about a coming Messiah. And then what you have is that a couple hundred years later, Alexander the Great comes to the world stage in 336 BC. And he begins to take over the largest amount of territory that had been seen to that point. that over the next 13 years, he extends his empire from Greece all the way to India. And of the many things that Alexander the Great was trying to accomplish, he wanted to communicate to the world and instill in the world the values of the Greek people. It's called Hellenism. And one of the best ways that Alexander the Great knew he could instill that is to make Greek the language that was spoken among the people, because inherent in any culture's language is the values of that culture. And so Alexander the Great instilled Koine Greek, common Greek, throughout his empire. And then when the Romans came onto the world stage, really in the 2nd century BC, and they began to conquer the known world and gobble up the remnants of Alexander the Great's Greek Empire, and now the Romans are ruling the world, Greek is the language that is spoken throughout the entire empire, even though the official language of the Roman Empire is Latin, because what God had done through Alexander the Great, now we have a language that everyone is speaking. And as the Roman Empire expands and it becomes the largest empire the world had seen to date, they said, we got to connect our empire through roads that people can travel on, as well as that we can move our legions around our empire as fast as possible. And so God allowed the Romans to create more than 55,000 miles of paved Roman roads. And in addition to that, the other thing God was doing in the Roman Empire was through their very first emperor, Caesar Augustus, who was on the throne for more than half of Jesus' earthly life. And something we explored in episode 125 in Who is the GOAT, the greatest of all time, Jesus versus Caesar, was all of the shared language between Caesar and Jesus. That at the time of Jesus' birth, Caesar was called the divine Son of God, who bring a gospel of good news, of peace and prosperity for the salvation of humanity. And you can check out all those fascinating connections in episode 125. But one of the things God was doing is that for the first time on a massive scale in world history was this idea that a human being could also be divine. And when you just kind of step back and you start to see, okay, what God was doing through Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and in Rome, He was preparing the world for the coming of Jesus. And as Daniel said, that when this Roman Empire hits the world stage, it's then where God is going to instill His everlasting kingdom. And you begin to see the intentionality of God, that even when our Christmas story begins in Luke 2, in those days, Caesar Augustus, it's like God is anchoring and reminding people Caesar Augustus is on the stage, and God knew exactly what He was doing. And Paul said it's in the fullness of time that God sent forth His Son. That as you just take all of this into consideration, you realize that the coming of Jesus wasn't haphazard. It just wasn't a casual timing. It had been something that had been planned since the foundations of the world. And one of the many things that Christmas reminds us of, and the thing that has just helped me so much this season, is to be reminded that God's timing is perfect. Not just okay, not just acceptable, not just plausible, it's perfect. That God knows what He is doing in the midst of whatever may be going on in our world. I know that probably for many of you like me, a year ago at this point, we wanted to kiss 2020 goodbye and never return to it. We were in the midst of a pandemic and we're like, 2021 is on its way. And now a year later, we sit here at the end of nearly a second full year in the pandemic, and things like Omicron variant is starting to surface in the midst of the conversations, and people are trying to figure out what in the world is going on. For some of us, it may be very difficult to look on this and go that God's timing is perfect and He knows what He is doing. Friends, this is precisely what is going on. That God is not upended by what's going on in our world or in our lives. And I believe that the encouragement this Christmas season is to trust God anew, to recognize that He knows what He is doing and that He is using world events to move things towards His sovereign plan. And for some of you, you have great comfort in that in this season because maybe things are going well for you. And maybe in the midst of things going well for you and things not going so well for other people, that there may be a tendency to maybe feel a bit of guilt. Don't feel guilt, feel gratitude. For those of you who maybe aren't doing well in this season, I believe that a great response is also gratitude. That when things aren't going well, we can focus so much on what's not going well and we forget the things that are going well, the things that we are able to be grateful for. But that doesn't mean that we dismiss the hardship, the challenges, the pain that we may be incurring during this season. But to voice that, to speak that, to lament that. But even in the midst of all of that, my hope is that for all of us, that we would be reminded that God's timing is perfect and that He's not going to make a mistake in the world and He's not going to make a mistake in our lives. And that the call for us this Christmas season is to rest and rejoice in the reality that this is a God who understands time. He is working in the midst of our situations and our circumstances, and He is moving it towards His sovereign plan. And so, friends, wherever you may find yourself this Christmas season, my prayer for you is that you would be able to rest, relax, and rejoice in this reality. Because Jesus Christ came into the world to bring salvation to all people, both now and forevermore. And may we enter more deeply into that story, be reminded that God's timing is perfect, and be able to rejoice well this Christmas season. So friends, as always, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening. And may you all have a very Merry Christmas.